Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to folks to the kickoff meeting of the Oregon Energy Strategy Working Group. To get us started this morning, I'm going to pass it to Alan Zelenka.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everybody. If those of you not familiar with me, my name is Alan Zelenka. I'm the Assistant Director for Planning Innovation. And Planning Innovation is the division that's heading up this work on the Oregon State Energy Strategy. And we've got a great team with us working on this. So rest assured, you got your A team working on this with our consultants from Kearns and West and SETI, not that SETI, and Edith Bear is our project manager. So next slide, please. For those of you that, many of you are, of course, familiar with ODOE. So those of you that aren't, this is our mission statement and what we do. You can go back and read that, but it is about the clean energy transition and protecting the environment and shaping all of that. And so what we're trying to do here is live up to that mission statement. So today, I'm really excited about this because we're kicking off the working groups, of which you guys are all members. And many of you know that HB 3630 directed ODOE to do this state energy strategy. And in addition, the energy strategy will help inform the second part of our climate pollution reduction grant, the comprehensive climate action part of it. We have a lot to live up to since you may have heard that we have got just received $197 million from US EPA for the priority climate action plan to do a whole bunch of climate actions. So we've got a lot to live up to. We're in the first phase of developing this strategy, and that phase is focusing on the modeling. And the work groups play an essential role in all of that. We've been meeting with our sister agencies and data holders to help shape the inputs into the modeling, but now we're turning to you to help us shape and inform the modeling inputs and all the questions that we need to answer. So I know we're asking a lot of you, but we very much appreciate your time, your expertise, and your dedication to this over the next couple of months. In this first meeting, we will present to you the modeling approach. Jeremy from Evolved is going to go over that along with Eileen from SETI. And it's the foundation of the work that we're doing. It is not the complete set of work that we're doing. It does not give us an answer. It gives us information. From that, we will develop the state energy strategy. So during this meeting and following each of the breakout meetings, we'll have the opportunity to ask questions and contribute your thoughts. We realize we've been doing this in a short time frame. So for this reason, we have set up an online portal for written comments. And we encourage you to share your written comments to us so we don't miss any of your great ideas. For those of you in the public who are joining today, welcome. Thank you for showing up bright and early in the morning. You're also invited to submit comments on our comment portal, and you have that link in a bit in our presentation. So we're looking forward to working with you all and learning what you have to say, sharing your perspectives, and helping us get our energy strategy in place. So thank you for showing up, and now I'd like to hand it back over to Ben Duncan to help facilitate.
Great, thanks, Alan. Appreciate the opening and some initial grounding, which will really be a theme of today. So I'm gonna do a little bit of housekeeping. We have a lot of folks in the room, and so everyone who's participating, other than folks you might see on the screen or the project team here, is participating as attendees, and that means that you're not going to be able to actively engage in the discussion unless you're promoted as a panelist, and I'll talk a little bit about how to do that. And so I'm going to walk through the agenda in a minute, but our time together is really built to onboard all of you in these working groups to the project. And so you're going to hear some presentations that will be followed by some space for question and answer. At that time, as you see on the slide, you can use the raise hand button on the bottom of your screen where it says raise hand, that function. Or if you are on the phone, you can press *9 and that will raise your hand and get you in the queue. So at that time, when you raise your hand, we'll call on you, we'll promote you, and you will be able to speak and be heard and responded to in the main session. I'll just note that with this number of folks, we may not be able to get to all the questions that come up today, but we're going to provide some other avenues at the end of our conversation today, both for asking additional questions of the project team and getting response or submitting public comment. So the chat function is available. You can use the chat function for technical requests. We have some project support folks that if you're having any problems kind of accessing features or tracking the conversation, just let us know. You can also use the question or use the chat function as questions come up for you throughout the presentations, and we'll do our best to answer as much as we can today. I'll just note when using chat, I'm going to ask you all just to be mindful of not using chat for what I call virtual side conversations. It can both be distracting and really not helpful for our conversation, but rather to ask questions. And then just finally, we do have members both of working groups and some members of the public. So just note that your chat will ultimately go to everyone. So we can go to the next slide. So as I said, as we move through our time together, you're going to have two substantive presentations, one kind of an overview and onboarding to the Oregon energy strategy, and then another presentation on the strategy modeling. So we're going to ask that folks hold their questions, and we won't be calling on folks until both of those presentations are done, but we have built in about 30 minutes for working group members, Q&A, for conversation and discussion. So, and then we'll land with some next steps. Hopefully you all seeing your journey as it moves forward. We'll provide an opportunity again around how you can also get questions answered, reach the project team, and submit public comment going forward. So with that, I'm going to pass it to, oh, actually, no, I'm going to pass it back to myself for working group agreements. Sorry. So as we're, we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Gilly. So as we spend our time together and as you all leave from this kickoff meeting and go into your working group spaces, we're going to offer the following both as best practices, but also as an ask, because these spaces are really meant to provide and result in productive, constructive conversations and discussions. And we know that, the deliberate attempt to get folks with varied perspectives from different interests around topic areas that are critical and important to the work that we're all doing together, that you're not always going to agree. And importantly, where you get to consensus, where you find agreement is really powerful, but also being able to disagree and deliberate with intention is also incredibly valuable and informative for ODOE as it does its work and for CETI. So these agreements we offer in the spirit of productive, constructive conversations. So one is to listen carefully, right? To really seek out and try to understand why someone might be bringing a perspective. What is their interest? What's their expertise? What's their experience that lends itself? So really listening to understand, to try to learn from each other as you do this work together, and to do so in a way that is respectful, that is candid and honest and open, but ultimately leading towards constructive and progress, right? We're trying to move together to advance this work in ways that will meet the most needs across our state. We ask that you have an open mind, right? Again, that you all may not agree, you may be coming from different perspectives, but that you're open to other ideas. You're not coming in so grounded in what you think that you're not willing to listen and learn and hear other perspectives. That you are curious and ask questions and you clarify and you try to understand the why with again, deep curiosity. That you're open, transparent, inclusive, accountable, that you respect differing opinions. A lot of this is building off each other. but powerfully, right? Seeking to resolve those differences in these spaces is going to be one of it could be one of the most important aspects of the work that you do. Finding common ground will be incredibly important, as difficult as that may be in certain situations. And then just recognize that, we all come into these spaces with different levels of experience. We have different personalities, and just really being cognizant of how much space you're taking up. So it's kind of the step up, step back model. If you're the first person to raise your hand every time we ask, maybe you take a moment, take a breath, create some space for others. And if you're one of those folks that sits back and processes and takes more time, push yourself out of that, not into the anxiety zone, but into the growth zone, and really allow others to contribute and encourage yourself to contribute. So that's an ask, as you all go into your spaces together. These are the best practices to try to ensure that, the conversations that you have, the deliberations that you will undertake will be productive and be meaningful for the work going forward. So Edith, now I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for kind of setting that groundwork. I think those are really important points, and I really appreciate you walking us through them. So my name is Edith Bayer. I'm Energy Policy Team Lead here at the Oregon Department of Energy. Very excited to be here. Thanks everybody for making the time in your busy schedules to join us today and to join us throughout the next few weeks as we work through the technical what kind of assumptions and questions that we'll be looking at in the energy strategy. So this is just a quick snapshot to give you a sense of the names behind the work. As Alan said, we have a really great team. Alan Zelenko, you've already met, is our Assistant Director for Planning and Innovation. Jessica Rikers is the manager for the Policy and Innovation team, and you can see her up here too. And then I'm the team lead, as I said. And we have here, we have 8 working groups, as you can see here. I think by now all of you have seen the list of working groups. We have direct use fuels and industry, electricity generating technologies, transportation, transmission and distribution, both pipes and wires, buildings, energy efficiency and load flexibility, equity and environmental justice, and land use and natural resources. And I just wanted to familiarize you kind of visually. I'm not going to run through all the names here, but just to understand that we have a lead from ODOE's staff, a lead and co-lead for each of these topics. And you'll be hearing from your leads in advance of each of the breakout topical meetings that we'll be carrying out over the next few weeks. So some of you might already have heard, and some of you might have meetings that are coming a little later, and you might be hearing from them soon. But please consider us to be kind of accessible here for you, willing to answer questions, and really excited to be working with you all. And with that, I'm going to hand it over, I think, to Eileen to present the CETI team. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Eileen Quigley. I'm going to ask Jeremy if we could switch presentations here. So I think Gillian, maybe you will stop sharing, and then Jeremy will start sharing his or ours.
And Eileen, this is just the introduction for your team. So we'll do the
okay.
SETI presentation down low.
Yes, thank you, Gilly.
Okay, great.
So Eileen, yeah, we do want you to introduce your folks there.
Okay. I'm sorry. I had a slide for that in my presentation, but I'll do so here. No problem. So Ruby Moore Bloom and I are managing this project. I am the executive director of the Clean Energy Transition Institute, and we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization whose mission is to accelerate an equitable clean energy transition in the Northwest. So I'm the overall project lead, and then Ruby on my team, who's a research analyst, is the technical project manager. We have a technical team, modeling team that includes a variety of people from the Evolved Energy Research team, and Jeremy Hargreaves, who's a principal there, will be presenting to you today. We're also joined with our technical modeling team by Elaine Hart of Moment Energy Insights, and Elaine is based in Oregon. And then we also have an equity team, and this is comprised of Mariah Caballero on my team and Angela Long at Rockrest Consulting, who is Oregon-based as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Eileen. You can go next slide. And I guess I should have said this at the beginning. Hello, Ben Duncan, he, him pronouns with Kearns and West. I'm a facilitation lead for our team. I'm joined by Gilly Garber-Yance, who's doing process support. I don't know, Gilly, you want to jump on screen and wave to the crowd? Let me see your face. There you are.
Hi, everyone.
So Gilly's also here if there's any technical issues. He can help support you, but he'll make sure that things are running smoothly today. Thanks. Go to the next slide. Back to you, Edith.
Thanks. So yeah, I'll jump back in. So I just want to start at the kind of the starting point, which is the bill that directs the Oregon Department of Energy to undertake this project. So HB 3630 directs us to develop a state energy strategy, identifying pathways to achieve Oregon's energy policy objectives. And it's very clear from the bill, and we're taking this very seriously, that this needs to be informed by stakeholder perspectives. And it needs to draw from existing resource plans, energy-related studies, essentially the existing work that's already been done or is ongoing in our state and our region. It's also important to emphasize that it's not just about identifying pathways to achieving our energy policy objectives. It's the benefit of this process is to understand the trade-offs of different pathways and to understand the benefits that can flow from different approaches and the costs. And so this bottom part of the slide here lays out the way that the bill kind of lays some of this out, the different factors that we need to take into account. Things like cost, efficiencies, the feasibility and availability of different energy resources and technologies. We'll be looking at economic and employment impacts. We'll be considering energy burden, affordability, environmental justice, and community impacts and benefits. We also have a land use and natural resources group. That's not a coincidence. We'll be having discussions in that group about impacts and considerations in those areas. And we'll also be looking at energy resilience, at security, and at some of the work that's happening around the region, very important work on markets. I just want to pause here for a second because there was a question in the chat on kind of what the working group's role is here. And I think it's important to emphasize that the working groups play a really important role here. So the working groups are essentially helping us make informed decisions. So in any given group, as Ben pointed out, it's very likely that we won't have full agreement on any one decision. But what we hear and the feedback that we get and the conversation that we have in those groups and the information that you can share will help us ensure that we have the best information available, that we've listened to all perspectives, and then ultimately ODOE will take that on and present a recommendation for how we move forward. And that's something that we'll talk about in our August 22nd meeting when we bring all the working groups back together. We'll do some synthesis. After we've broken out in little groups, we'll all come back together and have an opportunity to see the big picture, since there's a lot of overlap, obviously, between the topics. So they're not really separate. They're all interconnected. And we also have an advisory group. The advisory group met for the first time last week. That meeting's recorded. All of these meetings are open and available for folks to join live or watch a recording, view presentations afterwards. And the advisory group will be another place where, again, after we've worked through this with the working groups and we've had our August 22nd meeting, we'll take on board what we hear in that meeting and we'll present it to the advisory group for their feedback. So we've designed an engagement process with kind of multiple points of engagement, multiple points of kind of feeding back what we've heard, synthesizing and collecting feedback on what folks think about what where we've landed after we've taken on all of those comments. So I hope that that's a helpful explanation to describe a little bit in more detail how we plan to take on board what we hear in the working groups. If we go to the next slide, please. So the bill talks about pathways to meeting our state's energy policy objectives, but it's not defined. And so I just want to lay out how we're thinking about this here. The focus here is on clean energy and climate policies, since those are really driving a very important and fundamental transformation in how we produce and consume energy and interact with the energy system. So we have an economy-wide target set by Executive Order 2004 of at least an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. HB 2021 sets a 100% clean electricity standard for our state's biggest IOUs by 2040. And we have the Climate Protection Program, which we're following the rulemaking for closely, which sets a 90% greenhouse gas emissions reduction target by 2050. These are the anchor policies that are driving greenhouse gas emissions reductions across the economy and across the electricity sector, across fuel sectors. And at the same time, it's really important to recognize that we have a lot of other important policies that help drive and shape compliance pathways. And we are also taking those into account. And you can see a few examples here. There are too many to list on one slide. But we have the Clean Fuels Program, Advanced Clean Cars 2, building codes, appliance standards, renewable portfolio standards, and many more. So if we go to the next slide, please. When it all boils down, we'll come out with a report to the governor and legislature by November 1st of next year. That's a Saturday, so it'll be a Halloween deadline. And the energy strategy will take the form of that final report, which will have 3 parts. So the first part is a summary of the strategy and pathways to achieving our policy objectives, recommendations for policy options, and a description of stakeholder engagement and how stakeholder perspectives informed the strategy. And going back to the earlier point about how we build in accountability, we will have a written kind of report and accounting of what we heard and what we did with that information. And we'll share that kind of as we go at certain points, but also in the final report. If we go to the next slide, please. So this is a little bit more information about the structure that we've built in to inform the energy strategy. So we have an interagency steering group. That group serves to ensure coordination between state agencies. And I've listed here, excuse me, the main agencies participating in that group. We also are in conversations with other agencies. And that group meets about once a month. We have the advisory group, which I've mentioned already, which will also meet roughly once a month and represents diverse perspectives and lived experiences from across Oregon. That group is different from the working groups in that it's meeting throughout the whole process. The working groups right now are really focused on the next couple of months. The advisory group also has discussions at a bit of a higher level. It's not digging into assumptions and data sources. It might touch on some of those pieces where they've kind of floated to the top as really important topics to flag to the advisory group, but they're having more of a bird's eye holistic view of the process. You all are highlighted here because that's what we're talking about today, the working groups. You're helping us focus on the details of the modeling and the analysis that will come out of the modeling on some of those trade-offs. Jeremy will talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. And you're all subject matter experts who are able to inform our work across all of the topic areas that we're covering in the energy strategy. We're also consulting with tribes, so we have an ongoing process for tribal consultation, both at government to government level, but you might also see even in the advisory group, we have some tribal organizations who are also engaged in that way. And tomorrow, we're holding 2 public listening sessions. And the goal of those sessions is also a little different from the working groups. It's a broader forum. Anybody can join. The focus is to inform the technical analysis, since that's where we are in the process right now. But ODOE will be very much in listening mode. We will be trying to tee up questions so that we can hear priorities from the public and understand what kind of priorities, concerns, questions that folks would like to see the energy strategy answer. And that will also help inform our thinking about which scenarios we eventually model. And those scenarios will help us answer those questions. So if we go to the next slide, please. I think I'm almost done. There might be one more. So this is just a kind of a visual to understand the process in a little bit more of a chronological fashion. So right now we're in the stage of developing the technical approach. And as you can see, we have kind of stacked all of these or layered these various engagement structures to inform that approach. The one thing that I have not mentioned is the importance of EJ, environmental justice, and equity engagement. So that's a piece that we're working on kind of throughout the process. And we also held a webinar in June, and we plan to hold a webinar at the end of this process of working group engagement and conversations, meeting with the advisory group to report back to the broader public on where we've landed for the technical analysis. So, and then the modeling will happen. So that kind of takes us from now to the end of the year. We'll then present draft modeling results and provide an opportunity for written feedback. We'll move into the policy recommendations discussion, again, with the same kind of layered engagement approaches. We'll present draft policy recommendations kind of later in the spring. I don't have months here yet. We're still working out the exact timeline, but as soon as we have it, we'll be communicating that to you all. And then we'll be drafting the report and presenting a draft report again for public feedback before we finalize it for that Halloween deadline. So I think that's my last slide, Ben. I've mostly focused on kind of the process role of the working group. I'm leaving the description of the modeling approach to the experts who Jeremy Hargreaves from our consulting team. So Ben, I'll hand it back to you to transition us over there.
That's great. Well, I will pass it to the experts. And just as a reminder, we're going to ask folks, you can put questions, continue to put questions in the chat, but we will have a Q&A after the next presentation. So Eileen, I'll pass it to you.
Yes, okay. Jeremy's going to put up the slides. And then, yeah, okay. So I've already mentioned who I am. I'm Eileen Quigley, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the ED of the Clean Energy Transition Institute. Next slide, please. Today, we are primarily focused on explaining the technical approach to the Oregon Energy Strategy. And so Jeremy is going to talk about what energy pathways modeling is and isn't. He's going to describe the modeling methodology, and then we have slides on the approach to cross-cutting equity issues as well. And the next slide I've already done, and so I'm just going to turn this straight over to Jeremy. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Eileen. So I'm Jeremy Hargreaves. I'm a principal at Evolved Energy Research, and we're leading up the technical modeling. And the purpose of today's material is to give you some background and context about what is the modeling approach that we're taking, what can you expect from that modeling approach, and how is the feedback that going into all of these working groups this next month, how is that going to be incorporated into the work that we're doing going forward? So this first section here is just at a high level, what is energy pathways modeling? And what is it not? And there's a whole variety of different types of models out there that go into planning our energy systems. And this is one of those models. So I'll talk about how it fits with those other planning processes, and what are the expectations here. So first of all, what is the purpose of energy pathways modeling? So at a fundamentals level, this is a tool that can help us analyze what types of decisions we should be making in the near term in the context of where we want to go in the future. And if we contrast the type of planning that today we need to do in our energy systems compared to if it were 20 years ago, at that time, it was much more reactive. We would be forecasting our loads going forward in time and thinking about what types of resources do we need to build to meet those. But the difference today is that we know something about the future. We know that we're going to specific emissions targets. We know that we're going to clean energy targets. And so that time horizon into the future that would inform what we do in the present is now stretched out. It's much further into the future. And so we know something about what we want our system to look like in the future, but there are so many other things that are uncertain about how we would get there, what prices look like, what kind of technologies are available, policy priorities, all of those things that would drive potentially different decisions in the near term. And so by looking across a few different futures with our modeling, then we can start to illuminate what are the pros and cons of going one direction versus another, looking at the types of strategy that, if we're making near-term decisions now, will manage or mitigate uncertainty. And the other important note here is that with this modeling, we're not trying to predict the future, but instead we're trying to make robust decisions or choices in the face of an uncertain future before us. So what are we doing with the model? We are calculating the energy needed to power an economy while meeting those policy targets. And in doing that, we're looking for what are the least cost ways to provide that energy. And there are a variety of strategies out there to do that, building out the different supply chains of the forms of energy that our economy is consuming. And to get to a cleaner energy system in the future, this might involve things like efficiency, clean electricity, electrification, clean fuels, carbon sequestration. It includes detailed electricity sector modeling. So the electricity sector is somewhat in contrast to other types of fuels, something that we have to model on a short time frame to be able to capture the operating constraints and the challenges that system faces. And so we are modeling that at an hourly level and looking at the integration of that with other energy supply chains, optimized fuel supply. And as we move forward in time, we start to see an increasing integration or options for integration through things like the production of hydrogen, for example. We're not trying to answer all the questions in the energy strategy with the modeling, but we are trying to provide direction and a framework to understand trade-offs between different pathways, policies, and strategies. This is economy-wide modeling. It's looking at all sectors and the types of measures that we would take in those sectors. And it kind of is complementary to the other planning work that is happening. So what the utilities are doing with their IRPs, what state agencies are doing with planning for different sectors of the economy, what other organizations are doing, where it is often much more detailed near-term modeling. But this is providing that economy-wide framework that gives contrast and trade-offs between strategies in different parts of the economy, and can kind of act as a centerpiece pulling everything together. What does it not do? Just to set the expectations going into these working groups of what we can and can't do with this modeling. So we're not focused on one state or single utility service territory. We are recognizing that Oregon is part of a larger electricity sector. It's part of national fuels markets and potentially new markets for things like hydrogen-derived fuels, new types of biofuels. And so we are modeling that connection and that role of Oregon as a piece of these larger energy systems. We are not modeling liquid or gaseous fuels and electrification separately. And so everything is interconnected together. And we may see as we move forward the lines between traditionally siloed parts of the economy somewhat blurring, because we start to use clean fuels that maybe have a renewable or electrical component to their production. It's complementary to these other planning processes. As I mentioned, it's not replacing the detailed planning models that are happening at the utilities. In particular, it's not a loss of load probability model. So we're not carrying the 60 years of very granular historical data to be able to do those kind of calculations. We have rules of thumb, but it's complementary to that detailed planning process at the utility. It's also not a nodal production simulation. So we are running zonal pipe flow on our transmission sector, or transmission in the electricity sector. And so no sort of DC or AC flow constraints, and transmission planning at a detailed level would be done at the utility level. And then it's not a forecast. So it's designed to help with decision making rather than forecast what will happen in Oregon. And so it's kind of laying out targets for what we would like to achieve in the future, recognizing that there is a whole lot of uncertainty that's going into that, and what are the decisions that we can make right now that are going to put our best foot forward to achieving those in the future. So what are the characteristics of energy pathways modeling? So we are running least cost energy system optimization, and it's across 11 states. It's matching the Oregon's energy demand and how that demand is evolving over time with supplying the energy. It's looking across the whole energy sector and the economy. So all forms of energy are considered in there. It's structured to meet Oregon's energy policy objectives. All emissions are accounted for. So emissions from energy, emissions from other sectors. So when we're trying to meet the 2004 targets, then we're doing the accounting for that is going to be compliant with the policy. It's integrated and holistic. We're looking across large geographic areas. We're looking across the various sectors of the economy, fuels. It includes supply and demand of all forms of energy, not just electricity, and it's grounded in ensuring reliability and looking for least cost solutions. As a little bit of background about Evolved and where these tools have been used in the past, we work with most of the national NGOs on doing planning for at a federal level as well as at a state level. We have worked with other state and local energy offices, including in Massachusetts, Maine, Washington, California, New Jersey, to do state planning processes. And we work with a lot of utilities around the country. Most of those it's confidential work, but in Oregon we have worked with PGE for a number of years. And then others, we work with universities, with academics. We did the modeling work for Net Zero America and REPEAT with Princeton University. We work with Breakthrough Energy Ventures to do an annual decarbonization perspective every year that becomes the basis for a lot of national decarbonization work, as well as a number of other organizations within the US and internationally. Okay, so what is our technical approach here? I will start from the high level picture. There's kind of three components to it at this level. And the first is building a model of Oregon's economy. So this is a detailed bottom-up picture of all of the energy consuming technologies in the economy. So it is all of the air conditioners, all of the water heaters, all of the boilers in industry, all of the electric vehicles, ICE vehicles of all various different types. So everything that's consuming energy across all of the various sectors and subsectors. And we build a picture of what Oregon looks like today. So what are the energy demands for various types of fuels? And then as we move forward in time, how are the ways that we consume energy going to change in the scenarios that we're running? So when somebody is going to the dealership to replace their vehicle, are they buying an electric vehicle? Or are they buying another internal combustion engine? So those kind of assumptions are going into this demand side model to work out what are the projected energy demands between now and 2050 for a particular scenario. So once we've built that model, then we go to the second step there, which is the aggregation of energy demand across the subsectors. So what are Oregon's energy needs in total, the need for electricity and hourly demand, the transportation fuel demand, direct use fuels. And this serves as the demand for energy that needs to be supplied by all of the energy supply chains. So electricity production, all of the various types of fuel, natural gas, liquid fuels, and the supply side model, that third bucket there, least cost energy supply, that is our capacity expansion and operations model, which is working out within a set of constraints about, complying with our clean energy goals. What are the options for building out new resources? How fast can we build out new resources? What are the least cost investments that we can make in those supply chains such that we are meeting Oregon's energy needs between now and 2050? If we take that picture that I just described and nest it in the data needs for doing this modeling, that previous slide is the middle bar there, the energy modeling bar. And the demand side model we're using is the energy pathways model. And the supply side model is our regional investment operations platform, RIO. Looking at the data that's going into the modeling process, starting on the bottom, we are looking for the best available data sets that underpin the whole analysis. So on the demand side, this is first of all, what are the subsectors across the economy? What are the service demands for different types of energy end use? So how much heat do we need in buildings? How much cooling demand? What is our lighting need? What is our vehicle miles traveled? And then how are those likely to change over time based on forecasts about how population might change, how industrial activity might change, the changes in commercial activity and square footage of commercial space, etc. And then what are the types of technologies that customers can invest in? What are their capital, operating, and installation costs? What are our current technology stocks, including both the stocks, technology types, and the vintages of those stocks? And then similarly on the supply side, we have a variety of underlying data sets, including what does the existing energy infrastructure look like? What is the scheduled additions to that infrastructure, scheduled retirements? What are the types of technologies that we can invest in on the supply side going forward? How might those change over time? Those options change. What are their costs and characteristics, and how do those change over time? And then things like commodity costs, delivery costs, renewable resource potentials, the options to expand transmission, all of those types of inputs. And then moving to the top of this chart, scenario assumptions. This is where we are defining the differences between the scenarios that we're looking at in the analysis. So on the demand side, this could be things like, what are electric vehicle sales shares in every year going forward from now? And so we could imagine scenarios where we're rapidly electrifying our vehicle fleets, and then scenarios where we're moving more slowly on that. Maybe the way things play out, it's harder to electrify vehicles than expected. And so we have a slower scenario for that. Where we include the policies, things like IRA, that could impact the types of sales shares that we would see on the demand side. And then on the supply side, same thing, we have assumptions about what is defining each one of our scenarios, things like resource availability, the rate at which we can build out resources, the technology options available. And all of these things are constrained by our policy targets. So emissions targets, clean electricity targets. We have about 80 subsectors in the model represented, and some of the major energy consuming subsectors are in this list: residential, commercial, industrial, transport. And we're looking at this across the West in terms of geography for the electricity sector. I already mentioned that it's important to be capturing the interaction as part of a piece of a larger system rather than modeling Oregon on its own. That's partly because of balancing the electricity system and the transmission linkages. And the other thing that it's important for is to capture the competition, because Oregon is not going it alone towards lower emissions in the future. We know that the surrounding states, in many cases, have aggressive targets as well, and they'll all be competing for resources. And so making sure that we are realistically modeling that competition, both in electricity and also in fuels. So fuels are a national market, and the opportunity for clean fuels that are coming from biomass or from existing biodiesel supplies or from hydrogen-derived products. All of those things are resources that Oregon is in competition for with other places that also need to decarbonize their economies. We have started from a review of existing information and plans. We want to make sure that with this study, we are building on the work that has been done before. We're not starting from whole cloth here, because there's a lot of useful information that has come out of planning exercises and data collection across various parts of the economy. And so this, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is detailing some of the plans, some of the data sets that we are relying on for this study, or we have reviewed for this study. So getting into scenario development, and this is one of the key things if we think about this meeting as setup for what is coming in the working group meetings over the next month. Scenario development is maybe the most important piece, because we want to make sure that we are asking the right questions with this study. I mentioned that the energy pathways modeling is a tool to inform decision-making, but the way that informs decision-making in the best way possible is to make sure that we are asking the questions that are the largest uncertainties in Oregon, are the most important policy priorities, or the things that are going to move the needle the most between one future and another. And so that's where the input from everybody on this call will be really valuable to us to be able to characterize that. We are starting from developing a reference scenario, and this is developing an Oregon-specific database using the best available resources. And this past month, we've been going through meetings with various data holders to make sure that we are using the best available data sets that are out there. We are defining reference scenario assumptions. So what is the starting point of assumptions for stakeholders to react to and suggest changes? These are going to come into the working group meetings over the next month as something to refine. And then in addition to the reference scenario, we're developing a set of interesting questions. So what are the most pressing questions, the largest uncertainties, the state priorities that are going to provide the most valuable information to policymakers? And we'll develop a starting point study, some starting point study questions that can be refined and narrowed down to a final set of 5 scenarios to be modeled in addition to the reference scenario. Components of a scenario, this is showing a conceptual idea of some of the things that are going into a scenario. The process for us will be to develop a set of interesting questions and then translate those into scenarios with quantitative inputs. Some of the examples on the right-hand side there are demonstrating things that could be changed in the input assumptions. So vehicle electrification, for example, we could have more or less of that. Then there's things that we could switch on or turn off in the model. So can we build new gas? Is IRA going to roll off early? Things like that. And the model is optimizing decisions informed by those levers. So we're testing uncertainties, we're looking at the impact of different policies, different actions or customer behavior, to see how we would supply energy differently, what would be the different trade-offs between scenarios. If we do less in one part of the economy, we would need to do more in another part of the economy, and what would be the consequences of that. So the interesting comparisons between scenarios are going to illuminate some useful information for making decisions. The reference scenario database is using Oregon-specific data, and I'm just noting some of the data that is going into it here. So transportation data from ODOE, EPA moves, building data from NEA, benchmarking against EIA SEDS data for Oregon, the DEQ emissions inventory, planned resource investments coming from utility IRPs, data center and crypto forecast data and population data. And we are still in this process of reviewing these data sources and making sure that these are up to date and the best available. So defining key questions, this portion of the working group meetings, what is it that we're actually doing or looking for in this step? And we are really asking a couple of questions here. What do we want to learn, first of all? So what are the questions that are going to illuminate the biggest uncertainties in Oregon? What can we learn with the tools that we have? So that's kind of the second piece, the translation. How are we translating those questions into the modeling work? So the feedback in the working group sessions that will be focused on specific parts of the economy or topic areas is going to be looking at what are these interesting questions, and a format that we find works quite well is to frame these in a what if format. So what if things were to turn out differently, or what if we had different policy choices? And some examples are shown there at the bottom. So what if developing new clean energy resources is delayed? So challenges on siting and permitting new resources. What if consumer adoption of technologies like heat pumps and EVs occurs more slowly than expected? What if transmission expansion to access resources outside of Oregon is harder than expected? What if hydrogen pipelines and other clean fuel delivery systems cannot be constructed between Oregon and other states? So all of these are framed in a way that suggests an uncertainty in the future. One thing to note is that with one scenario, we can potentially answer multiple questions. So we take that first one, what if developing new clean energy resources is delayed? That could be an uncertainty where we would have liked to have more clean energy resources developed, but we couldn't get them because of unforeseen barriers to getting those resources built. But it also could represent a policy choice where we don't want to build as much because of stricter environmental controls. And so what if we were to limit the amount of clean energy resources built in the state? So that's a way of one scenario answering a couple of different questions and representing different priorities in state planning. So our step following that is to do this translation. So taking those what if questions, what does that mean in terms of developing a scenario? And a couple of examples are shown here. So first is, what if consumer adoption of heat pumps occurs more slowly than expected? Our reference scenario may have, for example, 100% sales of heat pumps by 2035. Our alternative scenario there, where it's going more slowly, we maybe only reach 50% of heat pump sales by 2035. And so that's an example of a translation step. Then the second is, what if transmission expansion to access resources outside of Oregon is harder than expected? First option in the reference scenarios is relatively unconstrained to build new transmission, well, be constrained by what the potential to expand a particular path looks like. But we could expand those paths. And an alternative there to look at limitations is to not allow transmission expansion and see what that means for Oregon in terms of local resource build, and the types of supply chain expansion that we would see. So as modelers, what we want to end up with is kind of a playbook for what we should do following the working group process. So we want to distill all of the information that we get and the refined questions, getting down to those 5 additional scenarios in addition to the reference case, and develop what their quantitative definitions are. And this is an example of that playbook that comes from the Washington 2021 State Energy Strategy, where we had a reference scenario, which was kind of the older idea of having a business as usual be a fossil future. And then all of the rest of the scenarios are meeting the emissions goals in Washington. The electrification scenario in this case was kind of like the reference scenario we're proposing in Oregon. And then we can see how the other scenarios are changed from that reference scenario. So taking, for example, transportation fuels there, where we are moving more slowly on electrification in vehicles, we can see the differences in that scenario that were used to investigate what would it mean to go more slowly, highlighted in the red text there. So instead of 100% electric sales by 2035, we're going to 75% by 2045, for example. So this is only an example and not indicative of any of the choices that we would be making here in Oregon, but illustrating where we would like to end up come September after the working group process, and we've decided what are the important questions to answer and what does that mean in terms of scenario definitions. So following our modeling work, we will get into some additional analysis that is looking at cross-cutting equity considerations. The first of these is energy burden and affordability. And the idea here is to look at the energy wallet for a variety of different customer profiles across Oregon. So not just focused on electricity, but all of the types of energy expenses that customers accrue over the course of a year. And the right-hand side there is showing an example from our analysis in Wisconsin, where the top chart has estimated energy expenditures by household, and we see how those vary across different scenarios. So baseline, we're spending a similar amount in 2050 to what we are in 2022. This is a kind of a fossil scenario. And then we have other scenarios that are either going to clean electricity targets or net zero economy-wide targets. And those have varied level of electrification. So we see in a net zero economy-wide case, then we're getting about a 20% reduction in our expenditures by 2050. But the distribution of costs are changing from largely fossil in 2022 to largely electricity costs in 2050 as electrification occurs. So that's shown for an average customer there. But we can also look at things that impact particular customer groups and apply this to the bills and the likely expenses that customers such as low-income rural customers or low-income customers in Portland, for example, what are they going to see with changing energy usage over time and these emissions targets in the future? The chart on the bottom there is showing the changes in costs associated with when a customer buys an electric vehicle. So if they buy it in 2022, their costs are significantly higher than an average customer. If they buy it in 2030, that's kind of the sweet spot where they actually save money over time. But if they buy an electric vehicle later than that, then their costs actually increase on a life cycle basis. And so this kind of analysis can illuminate based on when a customer invests in these technologies, can they afford to invest in these technologies? What kind of impact will it have on energy spending? And also, given customer profiles, what is the impact on energy burden for these customers? The second cross-cutting analysis here is air quality modeling, where our energy pathways and RIO models plug into EPA COBRA, and they develop what are the impacts on air quality over time from reductions in fossil fuel use. And that translates into changes in air quality, to health outcomes, to economic benefits. And then we'll be doing geospatial mapping. So using publicly available data sets to understand community level energy inequities and relationships to socioeconomic disparities. So mapping where are the low-income customers in the state, what kind of equity impacts those customers are potentially likely to see. And we can pair this with our energy wallet analysis to show where archetypal customer groups are located throughout Oregon. The type of metrics that will be used in this analysis are still in development, but these could include, for example, the energy burden, poverty level, access to internet, rural classification, and others. And then the final piece is economic and employment effects. So we'll be conducting a literature review of past studies in Oregon and other states. And one recent study came from CETI in the Net Zero Northwest Workforce State Analysis. That's one thing that we can draw upon in this analysis. It was conducted for Oregon, and then drawing on other studies as well as recommended by ODOE. And as we go into this working group process, what studies would people recommend us looking at to draw from for the employment effects? So I will leave it there and pass it back to Ben.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So there's been I'll just note, we have 135 folks participating, and a number of questions that have come through the chat. I'm going to start. Sam, you had raised your hand early on, so I'm going to call on you, and then I'm switching to some of the chat questions and responses, and then we'll come back to Brandon. So at this point, if folks want to raise their hand, we'll get you in the queue. You can add questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as much as we can. So Sam, can we unmute you? There you are. Ask your question. You're on mute though, Sam, if you're talking to us. Sam may not have been ready to ask his question yet. So Sam, we'll come back to you in a minute if you're hearing us. So why don't we jump into the chat? So Dave had a question around the level of detail the modeling can get into. For example, will the modeling scenarios compare whether BPA joins, I don't know if it's queso, if that's the pronunciation, or SPP day ahead markets?
I'll just jump in and say that I think we might have typed in a quick response, which is that that's outside of the scope of the modeling. I would just ask whether Jeremy would want to add anything to that.
Well, maybe Jeremy, before you go, there's actually several questions that seem to be related to the scope of modeling. Some have been answered in the chat, but if you could speak maybe broadly, I don't know if you can see the chat, Jeremy. If you could do a quick scan, I'm going to ask Sam. Sam, are you back? All right, Sam, we tried. So as Jeremy's doing a scan, I think there's several questions around scope. Some of them have been answered already, but could you speak to kind of the capabilities and scope and what the modeling can and can't do?
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of BPA joining CAL-ISO or SPP day ahead markets, that's something that we don't consider in a model because it's a physical representation model where you could consider the system operator being a benevolent West-wide system operator. And that works well for a long-term analysis when we're going out to 2050, just because we want to look at what are the ideal outcomes and operations for an energy system in the future, and kind of so setting ourselves a target for what could be achieved through the different mechanisms that are available to us today. So we can think in the long term of everything that is currently the way that we operate markets or regulate markets right now as things that serve us. They are mechanisms that should be suited to the way that our energy system looks. And if they're not serving us as we move forward into a decarbonized future or higher renewable future, then those would be levers to pull and change. So we're trying to level up above that a little bit and look at, if things were dispatched ideally, what would the outcome look like? And I think that the processes that you're highlighting there are efforts that are somewhat in response to changes that we're seeing already in the marketplace.
Right, thank you. Let's go to Brandon, who has a hand raised. And then Jeremy, as we're doing, I just keep scanning some of the questions. I'll work through them. Brandon, can you unmute and ask your question? All right. Let's see if we can get someone who can speak out loud. Eric Strid. Let's try that. I hope it's not a technical issue here. Eric, can you unmute?
Yeah.
Successful. Ask your question, please.
My question is, this modeling apparently relies on data and calculations that are all proprietary to EER. In the quest for openness and transparencies, to what degree can we trust all this modeling? How do we know the accuracy or gaps in the data or unintentional biases of the inputs or the interpretations? For example, how well does the EER model agree with other tools that are available, some of which are just open source and online? Thank you.
So all of the data that is going into it will be public, and that's actually a process that we've gone through the last few weeks of identifying what are the data sets that are specific to Oregon that are going to be give us the best characterization for the state. So the data inputs and assumptions will all be transparent and open at the end of the process here. And you'll see in the working groups the ones that are being used. If you have alternatives that we should be using, then please bring those up in the working group sessions. The models themselves, they are proprietary, and the challenge there is that, you know, it is our IP, but they also, in terms of the open source models, we include a lot more detail in there. You can see some comparisons. For example, if you look at our national hydrogen work, that work has been compared against about 12 other models that were also modeling the impacts of IRA on hydrogen adoption. And that highlights the differences and similarities. So there are some comparisons out there of our work with others. And we can also share a lot of detail about what are our models actually doing. And we have detailed technical appendices that we can put the details of into the chat or share them at a later date.
That's great. Thanks, Jeremy. We had a question around from Jennifer. Building new gas is prohibited in Washington. How does that factor in? Relying on imports? Question mark.
So building resources are they're constrained based on the policies that are set in different states, and so that does factor into the modeling. If we don't have the availability of resources in particular places, the model has to find an alternative for that. And so it is representing the realism of policy impacts that we see state to state.
Right, thank you. Alan, you had a hand up.
Yeah, back on Eric Strid's question. So the whole point of the working groups is to actually go through all of that information and work through that stuff so that we get the inputs into the model correctly, and that the work group is informed of that and helps formulate the inputs into the model. I'll also point out that what the model does is actually create what things will occur in a particular scenario, the reference scenario or any of the other ones that we look at. But it doesn't necessarily get into how exactly that particular action gets done, or the very detailed specific. A lot of the questions that we're getting here are like 2 levels down from what the model can do about, a specific difference between this transit and this type of multimodal transportation. That the model can't get down into that level, but it'll talk about the reduction in VMTs and things like that. And also the model, once we get the model in place and the scenarios run, the whole point of the scenario running is to compare each scenario back to the reference scenario, so that we can see if we go down this path, or we constrain transmission, or we can't get renewables in the pace we want, what happens to greenhouse gas emissions, what happens to energy prices, what happens to all these different factors that are the results that come out of the modeling. It doesn't give you the answer again, but it informs that conversation, so that when we get to that point, we'll be able to look at all that data and say, okay, potentially this is the way we want to go, and in order to go that way, we will need to we'll probably need to think about this policy and this policy, and we need to create this program and this incentive, and we don't know this, and this, and we need to research them. So that's kind of the end product of where the energy strategy is going to go.
That's great. Thank you, Alan. So I'm going to keep just moving through questions. I'm going to do a couple in the chat, and then I'm going to come to Pat. So if we can queue up Pat for when I call on you. So there was a question from Forrest: are future climate forecasts included in any of the energy demand scenarios?
So they can be. The underlying data sets that come from EIA do include changes in heating degree days and cooling degree days. And so in terms of forecasting increased cooling demand, then that is something that our model would be picking up using that data set. The impact on hydro, which I think is a more pertinent question for Oregon, is a challenging one to model the impacts of climate change on that. And one thing is that we are currently investigating is working with the Power Council and work that they've done to characterize changes in hydro capabilities to build that into our model as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. From Andrew: will you be able to show total cumulative greenhouse gas emission differences between scenarios?
Yes. So we will be hitting our greenhouse gas targets in all of our scenarios, but depending on the types of uncertainty or strategies taken in the scenarios themselves, then we'll be showing different ways of complying with those. And so if we are doing less in transportation, for example, because we're moving more slowly on electrification, then we'd be doing more in other places in the economy, and the model would show what are the consequences and costs of doing that.
Good, thank you. From Dave: another example for modeling, will it consider scenarios around penetration of low carbon fuels like renewable diesel, or only consider electric or hydrogen levers?
Yeah, so it's definitely considering clean fuels. It's one of the strengths of the modeling approach, where in that second step, the high level description of our modeling, where it's the energy demands from the economy, we have a demand for gasoline, a demand for diesel, a demand for jet fuel, for heavy fuel oil, all of those types of fuels. But when we are building out supply chains to meet those demands, those don't need to be fossil. Those could be a blend of fossil with biomass-derived fuels, with hydrogen-derived fuels, with existing biofuel supply, or biodiesel. And all of that depends on the costs of building out supply chains to meet that. And so the model will be solving for what are the best ways to meet our emissions targets, considering clean fuels as an option there.
Okay, thank you. Can we, let's promote Pat. Pat, can you ask your question, please? You gotta be unmuted, unmute yourself.
All right, great. Now, can you hear me?
Yep,
Yeah.
we got you.
Great. You answered my question on the reference scenario. That's not a business as usual, but it sounds like it's a optimized way of meeting the 3 targets that you've identified for the state's goals. And that the scenarios are then variations of that with regards to the key assumptions that you mentioned. But I'd like to know a little bit more, and please correct me if there's anything in that was wrong. But can you give me some more detail with regards to the level of, the level of detail in the demand sectors? For example, what are the various energy sector demands for buildings, and what's the level of detail, for example, in your transportation fleet? Are you looking at specific classes of vehicles, or is it somehow some kind of an aggregated demand? I'd like to know some more about that level of detail on your demand side. And I have another question after you answer that, if you don't mind.
So on the transportation side, it is the EPA use types.
Okay.
So it is pretty disaggregated by use type. And we can.
So you have compacts all the way to large SUVs and light trucks and heavy trucks.
Yes. Yeah. And we can apply different assumptions about what types of vehicles people are buying.
Great.
In those sectors. And then VMT's efficiency, the cost of those vehicles, the cost of the vehicle charging infrastructure.
Right.
All of those are specified. And then on the building side, then it is the different types of energy service within the building, and it's broken up by residential, commercial, and then industry has the building component of industry as well, where it would be the heating and cooling and water heating and clothes washing, clothes drying, cooking, the ventilation, chilling in commercial buildings. So it's broken out by those service types.
Demands.
Yeah. And then to meet those energy service demands, then we have a whole variety of technologies that could be installed in those buildings. And then when people replace those technologies, there are options for placing those. There's about 360 technology options in the model. And the efficiency of those technologies is broken up by vintage. So if a customer is replacing an older system, but they're replacing it like for like with a modern reference system, then the efficiency of that modern system is much higher because it's compliant with current efficiency standards.
Right.
Or they could.
And you have the additional EPA classes in terms of higher efficiency levels and cost levels.
So we do include. So it is compliant with current efficiency standards for all the technologies that are in there. We include the option to do high efficiency versions of that. So beyond the mandated standards, but we tend to favor a policy of replacing with heat pumps if we're talking about heating or cooling, rather than the high efficiency like for like, just because the costs are pretty high and maybe the footprint is a bit larger. So not an easy plug-in like install for only a few percentage points difference on the efficiency side. So we tend to favor a high heat pump adoption strategy in place of high efficiency like for like, if that makes sense.
When you say you favor that, do you often, I'm sorry, I have a lot of experience with this kind of modeling as well. And very often the heat pumps are selected simply because they are the most cost-effective choice when you are in a carbon constrained scenario in particular.
Mhm.
But so what do you actually mean by preference for them?
Just in terms of strategy going forward, and I'm talking from what I've done in past analyses, and these assumptions are all open to development in the working group sessions.
Great.
But my the strategy that would be lower cost likely is to be, instead of saying customers are going to replace their system with a high efficiency version of the same system, going for a heat pump instead. And we also represent hybrid heat pump options as well. And so you can install a heat pump alongside an existing boiler or furnace, and then have a cutoff temperature and take on some of that energy load with the new heat pump.
Great, great.
That's
So,
great. Well, Pat, I gotta cut you off. I know you and Jeremy could have a wonderful conversation. I'll try to get back to you. We got a number of other questions, so
Fine, thank you.
stay in the queue, and I'll bring you back up if we have time. Is that okay?
Great, appreciate it.
Appreciate you. I'm going to go back up. Nick, I had missed your question earlier around will the modeling include scenarios like substantial build outs of local public and mass transportation in addition to one-to-one replacement of gas-powered individual vehicles with EVs?
So on the replacement of gas-powered vehicles, definitely the logic in the model is assuming some sales share going forward of different types of vehicle technology. On the mass transit side, that is not something that we are representing directly in the model, but we do have a way to investigate that. So if we have an outcome of that in terms of reduced vehicle miles traveled, then we can model a reduced vehicle miles traveled scenario. The only caveat to that is that we don't have the flip side of the coin. We would see the benefits from doing that, but we don't know what it would cost to invest in mass transit or to put in other kinds of zoning policy, or have more remote work or more ride sharing. All of those things are very uncertain in terms of cost, but we could present what the benefits of getting VMT reduction from those kind of policies would be.
Right, thank you. From Catherine, if you aren't making assumptions about electricity market design, how do you model the competition of energy resources from other Western states with net zero electricity goals?
So we constrain all of the other states to the policies that they have in place. And then the dispatch that is happening is based on what is the best economics for dispatching that system on an hourly basis. So Oregon and other states all have the opportunity to be importing clean resources from other places, other than in the cases where there are constraints on doing so. So California unbundled RECs, for example, there are some constraints on there, and so those would limit the amount that could come in from undelivered resources. But delivered resources, all of those are represented by the real-time flows over the pipe flow representation that we have. And so it's going to be a little bit optimistic in terms of not picking up the friction that happens between markets that we have right now. And we do some adjustments, for example, in the coal fleet in the near term, where coal is being delivered to Oregon from out of state. We make sure we represent that. But in the long term, I think it's reasonable to assume that we go to a more frictionless system over time. And so I think we start off maybe with a less accurate representation of dispatch, and we go to a more accurate representation as we get more coordination in the future. But that's the complementary nature of this kind of modeling with near-term planning that's happening at the utilities, where they're better set up to do that with their nodal detailed transmission models.
And Jeremy, maybe you could, this is a least cost model, and it's dependent on the cost for all those kind of dispatch. Maybe you can talk about how those costs for all the different resource options get developed and what the cost curves look like over time.
Sure. Yeah. So there are resource options that we can invest in all of the states across the West. And on the renewable side, we've developed resource availability and resource characteristics for building out in those states. So take onshore wind, for example. High quality onshore wind exists in states like Montana, Wyoming. They have a certain output shape in terms of their hourly production, and those may be quite complementary to Southwest Solar, for example, where that's another really high capacity factor, high quality resource region. Building out a west-wide energy system subject to transmission constraints would look to utilize both the high quality nature of those resources and the complementary nature of those resources, where northeast wind in the west is producing at the shoulder hours on average at a high rate compared to when that Southwest Solar is falling off in the shoulders. And it's the same in all states. We have buckets of potential of resources that vary by quality, vary by cost, vary by their shape of production. And so we are selecting from those resources subject to their cost and characteristics.
That's great. Thank you. So just a note for folks, you all, I don't think, can see all the chat questions that are coming in. So we're doing my best to work through chat. Let's bring a couple the verbal questions there. I'm trying to go in chronological order. Let's promote Andrew and Jake. And we'll do a couple verbal questions, and then I'm going to come back to some of the ones that have come in the chat. Andrew, jump in.
I have a question, I guess two-part question, I guess. One is, will you be able to model different types of, for example, solar resources, for example, like utility scale solar versus commercial rooftop versus residential rooftop? And then the other question is, would you be able to provide a rough estimate of in-state generation of like renewable energy versus imports from out of state? And if not, is there a technical reason for that, so that you could help me understand that?
Yeah, so the answer to both of those things is yes. So on the solar side, then we will have grid scale solar resources, and those will vary by their location in terms of quality and cost. And then on the demand side, then we have the option for rooftop solar. And the model will have the ability to economically build those out. But it will tend not to do that just because of the economics of rooftop versus grid scale. But we will put in a forecast of how much rooftop at a minimum is going to get built out. So how much do we expect to be built over this time period, and that will be in the model. And the advantage of that is that even though just on a purely economic basis, the grid scale is winning that competition, there are other benefits to the rooftop systems that economic competition is not picking up. And one of the largest ones is taking the stress off siting and permitting such a large number of grid scale renewable resources. And so we will show the impact of, we will not show the impact of, but the rooftop systems will be part of that portfolio in the future. If we want to show the impact of that, then a DER focused scenario would be the way that we would do that, where we show what if we had higher levels of DER adoption, how would that impact costs? How would that impact the rate at which we need to site and permit grid scale resources? And is that a useful policy for Oregon?
And if I may, yeah, I just wanted to jump in because I think this is a perfect example, just to help people with an example of the kinds of what if questions that Jeremy presented on earlier, and that we'll be looking to help us define what the scenarios will be in the working groups. And this is one of the core functions of the working groups, is to dig into these kinds of questions and envision what scenarios would provide the most fruitful information to address kind of questions and concerns that folks have around the state. So I just wanted to point that out before we move on to the next question.
With an important caveat that we can't model everything. We have constraints about how much budget we have and how much the modeling we can do. So a scenario might have multiple things in it, so we'll combine things into a scenario, but because we're limited to how many scenarios we can possibly run, because it takes how many days to run a scenario once you got all push the button to go, Jeremy?
Couple of days.
Yeah, so it's not a simple chug and play thing. It's a very sophisticated model that has a lot of iterations in it.
Okay, thank you all. So let's promote Jake. We'll do we'll grab another verbal question, and then I'm going to try to run through a bunch of chat questions in the next 15 minutes or so. Jake. You're on mute, Jake, if you're talking to us. There you are.
Can you hear me? Thank you.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I have a couple follow-up questions that maybe tie together some of the earlier answers with that. And I guess in the backdrop of this is the statute says that, this exercise is to implement the state's energy policies. And I guess there's a question about how that's officially being defined relative to what's in statutes, which are a lot more electric power focused versus transportation, which is also dependent on a lot of the electric power. And the genesis of this bill really was born of, particularly Ken Helm, but other legislators, a history of concerns that the investment of the IOU utilities are effectively excluding primary options from the model for the grid power solutions, and in particular, like rooftop and Willamette Valley solar and a number of things like that. So I think we view this exercise as primarily directed at trying to remedy a lot of those deficiencies and ensure those things actually get modeled. And so I guess part of my question is one, how are we defining what are the policies of the state that are going to be implemented? But then earlier I heard you talking about public data sets and so forth. And so we've seen a lot of issues where, folks like, Wood Mackenzie and other, people with forward price curves and so forth are essentially presuming the outputs of the IOU IRP models, which are largely, a lot closer to rubber stamped. And those are the exact source of the problems that we have that we're trying to solve in terms of getting those other things in the models. There's, assuming transmission lines that don't exist, excluding things like large scale rooftop solar, Willamette Valley solar, and all kinds of alternatives that are, I guess both critical to success on electric power decarbonization, but also critical to address in the deficiencies we have in the model. So I guess I'm a little concerned about how you're going to approach those issues. And especially because we've seen a lot of those models, not, forward price models, et cetera, essentially assuming, presuming the success of IRPs and or build outs that are actually pretty impossible to achieve relative to actual grid constraint timelines, like, which, so thus if you're also going to assume California is succeeding at their RPS goals when they might be tens of thousands of megawatts behind, are those things then also, again, flowing through the model? So a bunch of questions around how you're going to approach those issues, but a kind of a core focus of this exercise for Oregon is fixing some of those problems so that we have an alternative, vision of what the state needs to do to succeed and can do to succeed.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't know if that's a Odo, Jeremy, and a preview of the conversations y'all are going to have in the room. Edith, do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I was gonna see if Jeremy wants to start by describing just how the model addresses some of the specific issues that Jake mentioned, and then I can come back and speak a little bit to the process.
Yeah, so I think the main challenge that you're highlighting there is that there are a lot of ambitious goals out there, not just in Oregon, but other places, and it's there are potentially a lot of barriers to realizing those goals, both overall and in the time frame that they've been proposed. And so there are options for us in through this working group process to be looking at scenarios where those things don't play out the way that we expect them to. So siting and permitting constraints being one of the huge barriers to getting things built in a timely fashion, particularly when you look across the West at the number of gigawatts that need to be located to meet energy targets. And so what if we can't build resources at the rate that we expect, or not expect, but have been setting ourselves up to do in policy? So that's one option, to do it in a scenario constrained way like that. An example to your point that we have seen in our recent work is that we used to have offshore wind being selected in Oregon in a pretty reasonable quantity prior to California setting a target of 25 gigawatts. If we include that target, it kind of eats that market for offshore wind, and we don't see as much being built in Oregon. But realizing that 25 gigawatts is uncertain. And so there's an example where there is an impact on Oregon, and it's determined by what policy is being set in other places.
All right, thank you. So, oh, Edith, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of points. One is that in the working group meetings, we'll give an overview of the data sources that we're using for kind of the key areas that we're modeling. And I think that will help answer some of Jake's questions about kind of where we're getting our information and what's going into the model. And I also want to say that it's really important for us to be careful not to contradict anything that the PUC has already weighed in on. I just think that's really important to make clear. We're not looking to relitigate anything that's been decided. We are in touch with the PUC and with utilities to understand what's in their plans and to take them into account in the energy strategy. And we also all know that the farther out into the future we get, the more questions there are and the more uncertainties there are. And
yeah, if I might, like, there's my concern there is if the base case is starting with hyper optimistic models that are functionally known to be impossible, we're not going to get the right starting points. And as a basic example of what we're dealing with in Oregon as a primary number one Oregon electric power issue is, the power lines from east to west over the mountains to the loads are heavily constrained, if not already full. Any new power lines will take 10 or 15 years to build. We have utility models showing that there will be transmission capacity 5 years from now, and at 2030 that will not exist. So I don't think that our starting place for this exercise, and literally the reasons for this bill being driven are related to this in the first place, should presume those same things. So how do we come out of the gate in a way that constructs the base case scenario, so not essentially presuming the impossible, but rather starting with the realistic functional constraints? Because the model can't choose rooftop solar in Portland if it's assuming that multi-billion-dollar transmission lines will exist that won't, and so forth. And that is functionally, the heart of this exercise for Oregon, achieving those policies. And similarly, the state has formally adopted legislative policies preferring, direct benefits in Oregon, et cetera. So, the question of how are you going to account for that relative to the, importing from other places and so forth, or again, also assuming decarbonization levels have succeeded in those places that are also functionally impossible relative to interconnection and transmission timelines. And that's, I guess, the heart of what I want to get to is actually starting with a realistic base case, given that part of the point of this exercise is to, actually achieve our goals and as well as to implement the formally adopted policies of the state, which are very explicit on some of these things.
Yeah, thanks, Jake.
Thanks, Jake. I'll be quick because I realize there are a lot of other questions, but these are really good points. They're very appropriate points to bring up in the transmission and distribution working group. I'll just add that we are modeling an east and west side to Oregon to take into account the kind of the constraints over the Cascades. And then what we will say about that, I think this is something that we'll work through in the group. They're great points. Thanks.
Yep.
Maybe have Jeremy describe how transmission gets handled in the model real briefly.
Sure.
So we're breaking up the West into zones, and for the most part, those are state level zones. In Oregon, we will have an east and west zone, and in California, we'll have a north and south zone. And then the flows between those zones, it's pipe flow constraints, so there are no Kickoff laws or anything that are driving the transmission representation. But for long-term planning, it's giving us a representation of what might be possible to move from one place to another. And we'll have options to expand those transmission connections. So how much can we get from reconductoring, from co-location of lines, from building new greenfield lines, and then constraints on when that's possible. So when is it possible to reconductor a line? When is it possible to build a new line? And those will be constrained in the model. One thing, to Jake's point, is that we are working with data holders to try and build a representation of what that east-west limitation is. And I think it's going to be hard to characterize the opportunities to expand it, but that is a focus for us to try and get to realistic options there.
Great, thank you. Let me throw two questions at you simultaneously. So there's one from Greg: how does the model account for the commercial and economic maturity or lack of maturity availability of various clean energy technologies? And then I guess not necessarily hand in hand, but from Mark, do you have good projections about future data center, AI, crypto usages? And there's a lot of unknowns there.
So on the technology opportunities, this is one that we have tried to limit that with a couple of exceptions to technology that is commercially viable and therefore has price forecasts already. And so this is not pilot projects or lab projects, because we don't know whether those are feasible at scale or what they would cost in the future. So that is a caveat to the analysis to say that in 2040s, it's probably quite conservative, because there are likely to be other technology options, potentially cheaper technology options, that are not being considered. The exceptions to that are that we do include direct air capture options, both liquid solvent and solid sorbent options, because particularly when we are going to net zero targets that some other states have, it is not possible to meet those targets without some kind of CDR technology. And so those are included there, but they're not showing up until later on. Our technology price forecasts come from public studies. So a lot of those are coming from NREL forecasts about what technologies are going to do over time. And then for things like batteries, we rely on vehicle forecast models, because in large part lithium ion has been driven down by vehicle adoption. And then we have electrolyzer costs and other supply chain components for different fuels as well. What was the second question? I forgot the second part of it.
It was the projection around data centers, AI, crypto usage.
Yeah, so this is a large uncertainty that is going into the model. It is a difficult thing to characterize, because it is a very mobile market. It's something that, depending on conditions, you could switch in a 6-month period as a data center developer to go from one place to another place. And so it's hard to capture that, but we know that the market is large across the US. We've done our own modeling, looking at regressions against different factors, and find that existing data center activity, pools of labor, are the things that are drawing people the most to developing in a particular place, and also proximity to information networks. In this analysis, we are proposing to use the forecast that the Northwest Power and Conservation Council has come up with for data center adoption over time. That'll be one of the things that we discuss in the working groups.
Yeah, that's great. Question from Martha: will we be using any of the climate tools like carbon offsets?
So yes, and that's something that we will get into more detail in the working groups, talking about the options for meeting the emissions constraints. So I think there will be differences between the scenarios that we're looking at. So in the 80% scenario, then I think the options there will be limited based on that policy. If we stretch that to looking at 95% or net zero, then we are now in a place where we will need to have some type of offsetting technology or NCS options. And so that's where some of that will come in, and the discussion for that will be in the working group for that.
Thank you, Jeremy. We probably have time for a couple more. So for Michael Lang, how would you model a potential scenario that includes the development of a statewide, quote, smart grid and distribution system upgrades and improvements to facilitate community level and household level electricity cost control, peak demand management, and resiliency, especially with respect to the cost for such an option and how those costs would be addressed and by whom, and how to navigate opposition by IOUs that may not see this approach to be in their business interests, so that the realistic feasibility potential for such a scenario can be evaluated. That was a mouthful, Michael. Jeremy, do you track that?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So it's getting into the types of implementation policy that could achieve outcomes for the state, and many of those outcomes will be modeled in our model. So the things that would facilitate would include demand participation, both in terms of building technologies and vehicle technologies, and that demand participation could be used for grid scale services, but it also could be used for local distribution services. And we'll be picking up the grid scale part and to a lesser extent the distribution part. So distribution, if we think about the distribution of avoided costs for capacity investments, it's probably average about $50 a kilowatt year, but there'll be peaks across the state, maybe up to like $400 a kilowatt year. And those are places where there's real opportunity for using demand side technologies to avoid major costs in that kind of infrastructure. That is something that our modeling will not address, because we're just using an average cost for that avoided capacity component. But it's definitely a good question, and one that we would see as being done through complementary modeling that is using much more detailed representations of the distribution system to address.
Thank you, Jeremy. So from Caleb, just to make sure I understand correctly, the modeling will not account for the general location of energy project developments for different pathways. Is that accurate? If so, I think that will raise some serious environmental justice challenges.
So the zones that we're modeling are East and West Oregon, but the potential that we can draw from has been developed through using a variety of different land use layers and considerations about what is the land that those resources are being located on. And so already the potential that we are drawing from has been screened for environmental justice concerns. And so that is one place where that is filtering into the model. Where those resources are specifically located is not something that we would be able to say, you know, it's in this particular county and on this site. But with looking at downscaling in post-analysis, we have the data to say we're building this much. It was from a data set that excluded a whole variety of different types of land use, and further analysis could look at where that might get located within the state.
Thank you. So we've got maybe a couple more. I'm looking to my ODOE team. Offshore wind, there's a question from Bill. Will Oregon floating offshore wind by 2035 be included in the modeling and compared to onshore wind and solar in Oregon?
Yeah, so we have that included as potential in the model. It is that there are costs associated with that are being developed by NREL, including for whether it's floating or fixed and the distance that it is offshore. And they have also developed capacity factors and hourly output shapes for that. And so it's being considered like other resources, whether it fits as part of a complementary portfolio.
Right. And from Mark, can you model household energy cost future, or is that a separate utility answer?
We're estimating that with the energy wallet analysis that I described earlier, where we're looking at the cost of providing energy to households of all types and how that will change over time. What that is not accounting for is changes in the way that customers are billed for energy. So what customer pays now is dependent on what their rates are. Those rates are going to change as we move forward in time, and we're not looking at those kind of distributional impacts, but we'll do an estimate of how the costs for providing the energy to customers will change, which in the long term is a good high level way of looking at that, excluding the changes in rates and programs over that time period.
Then are you factoring natural detriments like wildfires?
So wildfires are one of the factors that's included in siting constraints in the underlying data sets on renewables and on transmission. The impact of wildfires in terms of resilience is not something that we're including directly in the model. But I think that and Edith can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's something that will be contributing into the plan following the modeling.
Edith, jump in.
No, I was just gonna agree with Jeremy. Yeah.
It's always, I think that's a good idea generally. But from Ramfis, can we model what ODOE could do with unlimited funds and time?
I would love to model that.
Well, I mean, I think there's a scoping here, right?
Yeah, no, there is. Yeah, you're right. I'm being a little flip, but I mean, there are two things. One is that the bill envisions the energy strategy being updated over time. So this is not the only go we have at this. As Alan pointed out at the beginning, we're not modeling to find solutions or clear answers. We're modeling to inform our thinking, and information is going to change over time. We're kind of too late for certain processes and too early for others. The 9th power plan is under development, for example, and that'll be something that informs the next iteration of the energy strategy. So I think it's important to keep in mind the kind of the idea that this is something that we'll revisit over time. And I think the other thing that maybe Jeremy alluded to is that we could come up with recommendations for further studies that our current budget doesn't allow for and the current timeline might not allow for. But what we find coming out of this modeling exercise might indicate that it would be really useful to do a complementary kind of additional modeling exercise or some kind of other inquiry or investigation. And I think that we should keep the door open there and not worry about budget to constrain the conversation itself, and then see what comes out of that conversation, what those recommendations look like, and then go back to, whether it's something that's feasible to do.
That's helpful. So maybe in the last question, there were several questions just around how you model infrastructure, Jeremy. I don't know if you saw those kind of coming through the check, and maybe I'll just ask a broad kind of representative question around how do you incorporate kind of this conversation around infrastructure and the assumptions you're making?
So the model is really based around physical investments and operations of those investments. And so if we think about a supply chain, an example supply chain, take hydrogen, where renewable energy, we're building out that physical infrastructure for renewable energy production. That energy is getting delivered to or is co-sited with electrolyzers. We're building out the infrastructure for the electrolysis and the transmission in between to be able to deliver that. And then that hydrogen could go directly into pipelines as an injection in gas pipelines. It could be into 100% hydrogen pipelines. The model will be building that infrastructure. It's also building storage facilities if that needs to be stored. And then it's also building out the downstream infrastructure or midstream infrastructure from hydrogen for conversion. So if it's going to methanation processes, if it's going to Fischer-Tropsch plants, if it's going to Haber-Bosch plants, the model is building out those plants as well, and the delivery of the hydrogen-derived products or fuels. And so it is really the model is based around physical infrastructure build and the cost and operation of that. And so we try and represent all of the pieces.
Right, thanks. So let's pull one last question in around, given that most of the models look at least cost scenario, will there be an opportunity to explore best value scenario that looks at benefits for climate, workers, ratepayers, and economic development? Would that require additional resources and legislation?
So that's something that best value is a hard concept to define, just because those objectives are often competing with one another. You could do more of one, less of another. And so coming up with a best is always a challenge to do. The way that we get at those factors is by constraining the need for outcomes that are aligned with those objectives. So for example, if more jobs growth were a priority in the state, then we can constrain the model to be building more in-state resources, which would be more costly overall in terms of the energy infrastructure investments, but it would also have these additional benefits associated with it for jobs growth. And so we address those types of different policy priority by constraining the model differently to achieve them. The one model to come up with the perfect solution is something that, there would be trying to put dollar numbers to all of these outcomes would be a really hard thing to do, and a very contentious thing to come up with all of those values. And so we try and do this through different scenarios as the approach to capturing those outcomes.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Alan?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it is difficult to do within the model. So we are going to supplement the work that we're doing on workforce with a study outside of this, the model, that will look at workforce, the impacts on workforce. What do we need to prepare the workforce for different scenarios? Can't do that until we get the scenarios and the model runs done. So that's a later study that will then look at and try to get at some of the things that Ramphis was talking about.
Right, thank you. So we are at time. If we had another 8 hours, I think we could probably move through the rest of the questions. But Jeremy, appreciate you just fielding so many varieties of questions. Edith, there was a language conversation kind of emerging in the chat. Do you want to speak to kind of language of electrification, decarbonization?
Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I haven't had a chance to look at what the comments are saying, because my attention has been divided.
Okay, I don't know if Jessica?
I can jump in real quick.
Okay, thank you.
There were a few questions in the chat that had to do with using the term electrification when we mean decarbonization, and whether these two things can or do mean the same thing. And of course, that's a very nuanced question. It depends on what energy sources we're talking about and what kinds of technologies that we're talking about. So I just wanted to flag it that it was something that people were talking about in the chat, and that it is important to differentiate, but also to understand where electrification can help address decarbonization, etc.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So a couple things. So we didn't get to all the questions that existed. Hopefully folks see in the chat from Jessica, there's a long list of questions. You can also submit questions input to the comment portal. So if we can pull up slides, we'll move through part of our closing, and then we'll close with some other opportunities for you all to get questions answered or to submit comments. So Edith, you want to talk about the calendar?
Yeah, sure. I just want to make a point to, I think, something that was just put in the chat, which is that I'm really happy to see how many questions there are and how much engagement and interest there is here. We haven't been able to address everyone's questions. What we'll do for the working group questions that have come up today that we have not answered is to try to prepare answers in time for that working group, that kind of breakout working group meeting, so we come prepared with an answer. And I think that'll help us advance the discussion in those groups. And then just turning to the calendar here, so between now and August 22nd, working groups will be meeting by subject matter area. So again, this is kind of the list of those 8 different subject matter areas. We've essentially divvied up the entire energy sector into these areas. The land use and natural resources and environmental justice and equity groups will meet twice. The other groups will meet once. The reason for that second meeting for these 2 groups is that there is so much discussion that will be happening in other working groups that's very relevant for these topics that we think it's important to have an opportunity to report back on what we're hearing and have a discussion and kind of create a bit of a feedback loop into those 2 groups. We also realize that the time is really limited. So I want to explain a little bit or describe a little bit how you can share your thoughts with us. I realize that sometimes in a 2-hour meeting, you haven't had time to fully reflect and respond the way that you would like to, and you might have other ideas that come up following a working group meeting. That's totally fine. We encourage you to share your thoughts with us when they kind of, as they evolve, and would encourage folks to reach out to the working group leads and also to just go ahead and use that online portal for any additional comments that you'd like to add in addition to any discussions that happen within the working group. And on August 22nd, we'll bring all of the working groups back together, and that'll be another opportunity to provide further comments and ask further questions. And the idea of that meeting is that we will have had all of these conversations in silos, essentially, and we need to break down those silos and kind of reconnect up all of the pieces and have a discussion about how the modeling and the scenarios are looking based on what we've heard in all of these breakout working group sessions. I also will just point out and remind folks again that tomorrow we have a couple of listening sessions. That's an opportunity for the public to engage, ask questions. We'll be much more in listening mode. As I said earlier, it'll be much less focused on the technical details as today was. And again, just reach out to us if you have any questions. Thanks a lot for your time.
Great, thanks. So just really quickly, in our minus 2.5 minutes here, just reminding folks, written public comment can be submitted at the ODOE Power Apps portal, open until August 31st. And then the last slide, just knowing that there's other resources. So there's a project page. I won't read the link, but it's available online. To go through ODOE's website, you can contact the broad team. And Edith graciously, although with 100-something people on the call, Edith, good luck, has offered her email as well. So you can reach out to the project team directly. So Edith, I'll pass it back to you to just close us out, but really appreciate the energy in the room today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I just realized I forgot to remind everyone that these are open meetings. So if you're not in a working group, you're very, very welcome to join into the meeting. And if there's time towards the end, we will open it up to questions. Otherwise, they might have to come in writing. But we very much welcome other folks to call in and listen to the working group meetings. And thank you again, and looking forward to seeing you all over the next month.
Thank you. Have a great day.